They were right when they said it's not about where, when, or why.
It's about who.
And it's always been Loki. Hey guys, it's Sean O'Connell, the managing editor here at Cinema Blend, and we are back for another analysis video of Loki Season 2. We are up to episode number 5, and holy God, a lot of stuff happened. I'm going to bury it behind a spoiler warning, because you shouldn't be watching this video unless you were caught up on the latest episode of Loki Season 2. This new one's called Science/Fiction, and so much was involved. I honestly believe after watching this episode that Loki might be the one who created the TVA. We essentially watched him go through the origin steps of building what we have known as the TVA, and I'm kind of wondering if Loki is the He Who Remains we've been talking about this entire time. It'll make sense once I go through all the different points. So in the meantime, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications. You'll get new videos every time we post them. And for now, let's dive into analysis of this incredible episode of Loki Season 2.
This is going to sound strange.
All right, so let's pick up right where we left off at the end of episode 4, which is the time loom exploding and the TVA being destroyed, but not really destroyed because it was still intact. And we watched Loki walking around the different empty corridors and rooms of the TVA. But what's significant is that of all of the people who were in that room with Loki when the time loom exploded, he is the only one who remained, and his time slipping starts happening again, and he can't quite figure out why. We do see a moment where Loki picks up the TVA handbook and encounters himself in the same room, which is a little bit strange.
Hello? Hello?
But when you think about time throughout this entire episode, time is going to be very, very relative. And Loki even says at one point, like, time doesn't operate the way that we know it to be. And so to try to wrap your brain around where we are or when we are is complicated. It's always going to be complicated. There are times when we're clearly on a branched timeline and we're catching up with different characters and it's identified where we are. But every time Loki time slips, we're really on unstable ground. We're kind of moving around, figuring out what's going on. But the constant is that Loki and all the Loki variants that we know of, and in this case it's Sylvie, they remember everything that happened.
You do?
Why wouldn't I?
They don't get their minds wiped. They don't lose track of what had happened. Sylvie has very clear memories of what happened at the time that the loom exploded. And she still very clearly, even though it's gone back to her McDonald's in the 1980s, wants to maintain her own life on the branch timeline. They're still having their debate about free will and choice, and that's an important part of their journey moving forward. I think those two are always going to have that debate, and it's not dissimilar to the debate they had when they encountered He Who Remains for the very first time in the season 1 finale, where he essentially was giving them the chance to take over the TVA, to be in power of everything that was going on. And I think that's relatively significant because I'm kind of starting to believe that that is what happened. That Sylvie might have used her abilities to wipe people's memories, and that she's the one who has wiped the memories of the people who are in the TVA, so that when Loki goes around to the different branch timelines and recruits people like Don or D.A. Doug, I believe his name was, is Obi's name on the branch timeline, the science fiction writer, that their memories are wiped and they're being brought back into the TVA as variants to continue the work of the TVA that I think now Loki is the one who potentially established.
I don't understand.
To think about that, you have to go back to season 1. When Loki first arrives at the TVA, after he picks up the Tesseract, thank you, different area, he lands in a branch timeline, the TVA members pick him up, and we learn at the end of that episode that the main mission that Mobius was going on was pursuing a Loki variant, and that Loki variant ended up being Sylvie, but it leads me to believe that maybe the TVA, over the course of all this time, has only been tracking Loki variants. We found a ton of them in the void at the end of time, which leads me to believe that the TVA has been tracking Loki variants this entire time, pruning them and sending them to the void at the end of time. Now, we believe that He Who Remains is the one who has been controlling that entire area from control with everything that's going on over the sacred timeline in general. I think that's extremely important. One other main thing that happened in this episode that I really want us to focus on is that the failsafe plan for the TVA in this instance heavily mirrored the backup plan that He Who Remains had that we were shown in episode 3, I believe, of this season, which is take a TVA guidebook, pass it back to a different version of yourself, or at least someone in the past who can use the knowledge that's in that TVA handbook and use it to establish the TVA. Now, where He Who Remains, through Ravonna Renslayer and Miss Minutes, passed the TVA handbook to Victor Timely, in this case, Loki himself is passing a version of the TVA handbook to a younger version of OB, and OB is using that TVA guidebook in order to build a tempad. And again, when we talk about how time is irrelevant, when Loki catches up with OB later on and he says, wow, you created this tempad that quickly? And OB's like, well, I don't think 19 months is that quickly, but for us, it was minutes. Time is irrelevant.
So what now?
I also think it's really important to point out that in this episode, Victor Timely and Renslayer and Miss Minutes were not part of it. When Loki was putting the quote-unquote band back together and trying to recruit all the people whose temporal auras he needed in order to get them back to that time and place right before the loom was destroyed, I kind of assumed that Victor would be one of those people that he needed to collect. And he didn't. And I think that there's some significance to that. I don't quite know yet what it is, but not needing Kang, He Who Remains, Victor Timely's temporal aura seems really strange to me when just prior to that, they needed a variant of Kang in order to use his temporal aura to create the last tool that they needed to fix the time loom. And yet now, in order to get back to the place where the time loom exists, they didn't need Victor's temporal aura. That seems to go against everything that we believed, unless you're putting extra significance on the presence of Loki and the presence of Sylvie and their temporal aura in order to get back to the place before the time loom existed.
We're all writing our own stories now.
I want to talk about time slipping, which is obviously very important over the course of this episode. Loki being frustrated by the fact that it comes back, and yet figuring out through the help of OB and some really deep philosophical talking that there's a way to control his time slipping, and it doesn't have anything to do with the when and the where and the why, but it very much has to do with the who. And again, we're back to He Who Remains. If Loki is focusing on himself and he is the reason why he's able to control his time slipping, then it's either this Loki, our own Tom Hiddleston that we've been following, or a different Loki variant higher than the one that we have been following this whole time, who might be controlling this entire thing. Back in season 1, when Loki was figuring out what the TVA was, kind of learning about it for the very first time, when our prime Loki variant was trying to figure out just how important the TVA is to the grand scheme of things, he finds a place where he realizes that Infinity Stones, which have been driving the Infinity Saga in the MCU this entire time moving forward, are basically paperweights in the TVA. That's how irrelevant they are to the power that is available to whoever controls the TVA. Now we learn that Loki is able to control his ability to time slip, and we see it take place. He goes back a minute. He goes back another minute. We keep rewatching the events play out in that room, in OB's room, essentially. And now he controls it. Now he has the ability to essentially time slip wherever he wants to go. That signifies to me that he is becoming the most powerful being. If he has the ability to travel through time and space and go wherever he wants to go, this is why I think you're able to say, oh, maybe Loki was powerful enough to go back to these different areas, go deep into the past, establish the TVA, pluck these important people, the variants of these important people off of their branch timelines, establish them in the TVA, and then keep that timeline going. So let's walk through a theory where there's a time gap that we don't quite understand. We saw Sylvie, who uses her magic, which we've seen her do, to wipe the memories of the people who are in the TVA. And that they are the two who are essentially controlling the power of the TVA, because Loki has this now ability to control his time slipping. This would make a ton of sense as to how those two would potentially establish He Who Remains, or Kang, as a figurehead that the TVA is all working towards. This could even work towards why they set up the idea of the 3 timekeepers. Let's just say that those 3 timekeepers that are established right there, one is Loki, one is Sylvie, and one is Kang. It's very possible that the roots of the TVA, while Kang is still established and important to it, the other two are Loki and Sylvie, 2 very important Loki variants. There's something major going on here, and I think a lot of this is going to get revealed in the season finale, but we're learning that Loki is far more powerful than than we ever believed possible.
It was a fiction problem.
And there's something also to the fact that when he was time slipping through, and again, this gets into the philosophical slipping, he was mainly time slipping to places that we had seen before. And at one point, he time slips back into that time theater, which back in season 1, we watched him sit in and watch the events of his life. That Loki, when he watched that happen, he realized that, you got to remember, that was 2012 Loki. That was Loki stepping out of the first Avengers movie, coming right after the Battle of New York. He was able to watch the events of his life, his future, play out. And that shows to him the power of, if you're able to time slip and you can move around to any time or place, you have the ability to go forward, you have the ability to go back, like just how powerful that is. I think the fact that he jumped back into that theater was a reminder to us of like, hey, this Loki was able to see ahead in time and back in time. And I think it's maybe educating him on the power of time and space and his ability to control that time slipping. I do think that that's really, really significant.
How much longer are we going to be? Some of us have time-sensitive activities going on.
There's one more.
Before we close out this analysis video and this concept that maybe Loki and Sylvie are more significant to the creation of the TVA as possible, I just want to talk about how emotional this episode was and how character-driven it was and how incredible Tom Hiddleston is as Loki, as this character. When you look at where he began, you know, as this petulant, you know, God, essentially, who has these powers and can't quite figure out how to use them to get what he ultimately wants, which is a family. He wants to fit in with, you know, Thor and Odin and the Asgardians, but he's a frost giant and he's an orphan. And he's always been an orphan. And it was the anger at that drove him, you know, against Earth in the Avengers. And it was that temper that made him such an issue in Thor: The Dark World and also Ragnarok, and then ultimately to his end in Infinity War. Well, now he's essentially building the TVA as he sells Sylvie selfishly because he wants his friends back. Like, this is his community. These are his close people. And if you go back to Avengers 2012, you know, you had Loki standing over the humans and essentially referring to them as insects who need to bow to his will. And now he's relying on humans that he's plucking off of sacred timelines to put themselves back together to build himself a community and a family of friends that he values more than anything else. And Tom Hiddleston plays this so beautifully. Like, he's so great physically, being able to, you know, like, it's a really funny scene where he's trying to control the time slipping. It's not unlike sort of Bruce Banner in Infinity War trying to make the Hulk come out. And that can be played for laughs, but like, there's so much weight behind what Tom Hiddleston is trying to do. You know, he's able to sell the emotions of this complete arc over just 2 seasons of a show. And I have to applaud everything that's going into the writing and the production, entertaining the idea of shifting away from Kang and maybe going to Doctor Doom as a big bad overall so they could recast or get an actor in there. There's no reason why Loki can't become the villain again. I know he was a main villain throughout phase 1, but this is a different character that we're talking about. And it's a different character who's rooted very heavily in this concept of time travel and the TVA and what eventually could become the multiverse again if they're able to manipulate the time loom and explode it out to a place where Loki's in control of all the different multiverses. I'm not saying that Marvel has essentially written themselves out of this problem, because there's still plenty of issues that come out, because what we learned about Kang the Conqueror and Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania still suggests that there are multiple Kangs and Kang is supposed to be an issue moving forward. But there's a lot of weight to what Loki is doing. And based on where the season finale leaves him, I'm going to be, you know, thrilled to see where the MCU is kind of moving forward. In the meantime, we have one more episode of Loki Season 2, the grand finale. So we're going to be back here on Cinema Blend's YouTube page, breaking down all the things that we think are happening with it. I want to hear from you guys if you think that my theories are legit, or am I completely way off? Do you guys have other theories that you've come up with based on watching the events of episode 5? Head down to the comments down below. I want to see everything that you guys are weighing in. I will comment back and we'll have conversations down there. In the meantime, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and we'll be back here next week for the season finale wrap up of Loki Season 2.